Contrary to popular opinion, and even the opinion of many academics, the public works that Robert Moses created throughout the metropolitan New York region, Long Island, upstate New York, the Niagara frontier, so-called, were not the exclusive fruit of his admittedly fertile, if not devious, mind alone, right? These were huge public works that were really the fruit of, or the work of a gifted assembly of consultants about whom we know very little, about whom almost nothing has been written. Othman Aman, the bridge designer, is really the only one who's been treated to any kind of scholarly attention. And many of these men and women came from Westchester County, which in the 1920s, and this may strike you as something somewhat surprising, but in the 1920s, Westchester County was not only America's foremost builder of public works, but the foremost builder of public works in the world, right? Its most noteworthy creation was a regional park system, right? Lashed together by all these beautiful parkways. I'm sure some of you may have been on one of these roads even earlier today. These were state-of-the-art motor roads. They were really the first modern highways in the world. And the person largely responsible for the conception, the planning, the design of the Westchester County Park system was Gilmore Clarke, right? One of the two gentlemen that this book is about and that I'll talk about tonight. Clarke was a native son of New York. He was a New Yorker, dyed in the wool. He grew up on the Upper West Side, he, in fact, his grandfather had a very successful, very popular. He served in World War I right after Cornell. That's him on the left there in France. His grandfather had a very successful floral business and operated his own greenhouses on the Upper West Side. And I'm sure many of you recognize where this is, 78th and 70th. Anyone want to guess what's here now? The Apthorpe, right. And that, in fact, it was the construction of that building that led to the demolition of his greenhouse complex, and they were moved up to the Bronx. In any case, this was being the Gilded Age. The floral business was a booming business back then. Anyway, Clarke studied what at the time was called rural art at Cornell. It was the predecessor to the landscape architecture program. He graduated in 1913. This is what Cornell looked like then. This is a little bit later, but these elms, these are American elms. They are long gone, right? Dutch elm disease wiped them out. He graduated in 1913 and actually would many years later return to campus and become the first professor of city planning in the department that he effectively founded, the department that I've taught in for 12 years now. He later served as the dean of the College of Architecture for many years as well. Clarke's career really gets launched when he's hired as the superintendent of construction on the Bronx River Parkway, which, and I'm sure many of you know this, began actually not as a road project at all. Road drive is not mentioned hardly at all in the early planning. It was a stream reclamation project. It was meant to clean up the Bronx River. There were very terrible racist overtones to that effort that I won't get into, but I talk about in the book. In any case, the planning of this road fell largely to Clarke. He wasn't the only person working on it, but he played a lead role. This really becomes, and again, almost by accident, it's an afterthought that they place a drive through this linear park. And then in time, with everybody acquiring these beautiful new Packards and Duesenbergs in Westchester, it's like, well, why don't we really make a beautiful road here? And that's what they did. So the road becomes the dominant element of this this linear park project. And this is the first public modern highway in the world, right? And I by that I mean limited access, right? Grade separated crossings, set in a wide right of way, right? And engineered, designed to enable the sustained high speed, relatively speaking, operation of motor vehicles. High speed, the speed limit was, the top speed was that it was designed for was 35 miles an hour. That's today with a flat tire with your lights flashing. And this is what, you know, this is, and as I said, there's not a highway in the world today that doesn't have some of its DNA, right? This was something really new under the sun. And Clarke goes on to oversee the design of the Sawmill Parkway, the Hutchinson River Parkway, the Cross County, later on the Taconic State Parkway, right? And all of which functioned as not just motor roads, but these long ribbon parks, right? And this may be very hard for us to imagine today, especially for any of you who may have driven down on one of these roads this afternoon. But these roads were considered an amenity by the public, right? Not just the driving public. Wherever they ran, property values soared, because they were seen as parks first, roads second. Also, the vehicles being used back then were not, you know, 4,000-pound Escalades, right? They were these little things that had like the equivalent of a model airplane engine in them. So they were very quiet. And in turn, these roads are arrayed, assembled, networked to link up a vast regional system of parks and open spaces, right? And here you see this lovely watercolor wash rendering of the early park system, right? And this is really an extraordinary creation here. Well, I like to think of this as central. If you take the core, the vernal idea of Central Park, right, as this cartridge of pastoral landscape that's kind of injected into the hide of Manhattan as a prophylaxis against all sorts of, you know, urban ills, real and imagined. Imagine that now expanded, extruded out over this entire landscape in response to this wonderful new technology, the new means of mobility, right? So it's like Olmsted in the automobile now, right? And it's the first park system of the motor age anywhere in the world. And planners, engineers, municipal officials come from all around the world to study this, right? And to learn from it. None of these visitors was as eager a student of all this as the gentleman you see on the right, who is of course Robert Moses, right? And Moses was, of course, as I'm sure you all know, really the greatest builder of public works, parks in U.S. history. He was a brilliant administrator. He was unmatched, really, in finding the ways and means to fund and bring into fruition, bring into being these enormously complex projects, right? It really in the art and science of what he always would describe as getting things done. He was often asked, you know, what do you believe in? And he said, I believe in limited objectives and in getting things done. And doing this and doing it well meant having on hand top shelf design and planning and engineering talent, right? And Moses well understood this, right? He, in a 1936 speech, he admitted that, and I'm quoting here, without the experts and engineers, we would not get anywhere. They do most of the work and they get very little of the credit. He was, in effect, implicating himself here because Moses had a colossal ego and was not particularly inclined to share credit, right? Something Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, kind of exacerbates in many ways by minimizing, I think, the formative role of his consultant team, right? And these are just a few of them you can see here. Amar Embury, the architect in the smaller image. Othman Aman, the bridge engineer on the right. Emil Prager here. Jack Madigan of Madigan Highland. There's a whole constellation of men and women about whom we know almost nothing, right? And it's partly for this reason. And of course, Clarke and Rapuano are part of this team, right? Moses had already looked to Westchester's park system as the inspiration for his visionary 1922 New York State Park Plan, which really created the structure of the state park system that we know today, and as well as the prototype for the Long Island State Park system, right? He tapped Clarke. He tried to recruit Clarke to help, build that, but Clarke agreed to advise him on the northern and southern state parkways. And also on that crown jewel of the park system, Jones Beach. But it was the Great Depression and the New Deal that brought their orbits into full alignment, Clarke and Moses, right? And effectively launched what the landscape architect Laurie Olin has called, and I quote, one of the most fruitful collaborations in American design history, right? This is Moses. Moses comes into power really here in the city in 1934 as part of the LaGuardia Fusion administration, and appoints Moses commissioner of the newly consolidated citywide park system. Prior to 1934, there were like 4 different parks departments. So what evolves here is this remarkable collaboration between Moses and Clarke. This is Clarke at around that same time, that calls to mind and mirrors several in history, right? You can think of during the Renaissance, the collaboration between the Pope Sixtus V and his architect Domenico Fontana. Or even closer in spirit was the collaboration of Eugene Haussmann and his landscape architect Adolf Alfond, right? So the Moses-Clarke union or collaboration mirrors especially Haussmann and Alfond, and of course Moses thought of himself as a modern Haussmann. He effectively wrote about that and compared himself very favorably to the Parisian. This was during the Second Empire of Paris, 1850s. So anyway, Moses becomes commissioner, and he appoints Clarke. He really makes Clarke his park design czar, right? And gives him enormous authority over park planning and design. Over the next 5 years, they lead what becomes the largest urban park reconstruction effort in U.S. history. Caro has a whole chapter about this. I think it's titled 1 Year. It's a remarkable campaign that changes the face of the city and that gives us a legacy of parks and open spaces that millions of people enjoy to this day, right? Now, Clarke, not surprisingly, turns to his Bronxville shop and brings a lot of those people down to the city to help with this. And really, first among them is this young, brilliant landscape architect named Michael Rapuano, who you see in this portrait here. Rapuano grew up on the north side of Syracuse. He was the son of Italian immigrants. He wins a football scholarship to Cornell and really shoots to the top there. He graduates in 1926, he studies landscape architecture there, a field he had been introduced to by his dad, who was a foreman with the Syracuse Parks Department. He graduates at 26. He wins the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture the following year. Back then, the Rome Prize was 3 years on the Janiculum Hill. That's not the case anymore generally. And Clarke hears about, because Clarke's, kept in touch with the Cornell scene. He hears about this young guy and recruits him immediately to Westchester when he gets back from Rome in 1930. And here you can see, this is Mike Rapuano on the left. That's Clarke is the tall guy standing on the curb there. This is Tanaka Tona here. He was a Japanese landscape architect. He was a classmate of Clarke's at Cornell, who went on to become a very prominent landscape architect in Tokyo. This is one of only 2 photographs in all the years I've been focused on this subject where Clarke and Rapuano appear in the same frame. The only other one was taken with both of them looking very sullen on the day that they sold the firm in 1972 to the remaining partners. So anyway, this was taken at Woodland Park in Westchester, right off, I think, the Sawmill Parkway, but I may be wrong about that. In any case, he's recruited down to Westchester, and he works on a number of projects there that I'll show you in a moment. But in New York City, of course, Rapuano was recruited there to work with Clarke, and with Moses, these men really helped create some of the most iconic parks that we know here in the city today. Rapuano was put in charge of the Parks Department's landscape design division, right? Where his studies of Italian Renaissance gardens and spaces helps yield a whole new design vocabulary for city playgrounds and parks. And these sort of neo-Italianate spaces become a wonderful hardscape counterpoint and complement to the earlier Anglo-Romantic parks of the Olmsted era, right? And it really works beautifully together as a whole. Rapuano develops a number of signature design moves, which I'll show you in a bit here. These are some of his, and he had a wonderful hand, as they say. These watercolor wash renderings are just luminous. And you can see this Moses here, Clarke Rapuano is the designer. And so this new vocabulary really is brought to the city. This is the Conservatory garden. That, of course, is Bryant Park before those beautiful scroll shrub plantings were destroyed. So a number of signature design moves. One of these is a device that Clarke had used to good effect in Westchester, and it's this axial it's like a maul and caliper arms structure. It's the best I can describe it, which often terminated with a kind of curving scalloped beachfront, right? And here you see this is Reese Park, right? There's the you can see that mall, right? And then the caliper building here. This was by Amar Embury, and then this curving beach. This is something that Rapuano uses at Orchid Beach Park in the Bronx. You can see up there. It almost looks like a kind of crawfish or a scorpion. So Clarke had used this at Playland, right? You could see the mall and caliper structure here. And he uses it in other places, even Jones Beach, right? You can see here and on the other side. We don't have a pointer, do we? Laser? No. So right on the other side, you can see the same structure here. And even this was an early scheme for the New York, the 1939 New York World's Fair. And you can see again that sort of device being used. Another design move that Rapuano was especially fond of was something, it was really a Baroque spatial trick, right? And this was the use of a tapered or a trapezoidal structure, a mall or plaza, to force the perspective, right? To create an optical illusion of greater or foreshortened depth, depending at which end you were standing, right? It's something he knew well from his studies in Rome, the Campidoglio here, from this early, well, the original and unbuilt scheme of Bernini's for St. Peter's here. Only part of this is built, but you can see that the forced perspective. He may have known about that. He probably did, but I never found evidence of it. But Borromini's Palazzo Spada. Has anyone been to this? You have, okay. It's a spectacular, so you see this is, did I say Bernini? It's Borromini. So this is, and then once somebody steps in there, the illusion is revealed. You know, it's really, really works. So anyway, you can see Rapuano playing with this or using this in a number of places, right? And he uses this throughout his career, right? So you see, this is the, unfortunately, you know, I should have gotten this book out years ago because a number of places have been destroyed because, you know, people didn't realize these are designed places with meaning and significance and not just Moses, fuck Moses. You know, so this was destroyed more recently, about 10 years ago. This is Battery Park. This is Randall's Island. You can see the tapered mall there. Even in the original scheme for Idlewild Airport, now JFK, you could see that that's long gone, right? That's been rubbed out many years. He even returns this device to its homeland in his plan for the American military cemetery in Florence, right? You can see the structure there. Clarke and especially Rapuano were also largely responsible for making the London plane the iconic tree that it is in this city, right? I wrote a piece about this, if you want a short version and not the book version, for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. The London plane you know, people, it's not the most beloved tree. You know, it sheds, it's like a cat, it sheds a lot. And it doesn't turn glorious colors in the fall, but it's the best street tree we have ever had. And it was an accidental hybrid between the American sycamore, which was brought over the Atlantic by the early botanical explorers, and Platanus orientalis, the Asiatic plane that had centuries earlier was brought west by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and they crossed somewhere, either in England or possibly in Madrid. But the result was this street tree, the London plane, Platanus acerifolia, that is really it becomes this icon of many cities, but certainly New York. And really the connection here with Rapuano is that he falls in love with this tree in Rome, right? And you know, Ottorino Respighi aside, Rome is really a city of plane trees, not pines, right? As any of you probably know. This is in Trastevere. On the Janiculum Hill, there's magnificent rows of this tree that he would have known very well. He also brings back from Italy, from the Villa Aldobrandini, which you see here, and from the Villa Lante, this geometric grid form of planting the plane tree, right? You can see here and here. These trees are 500-600 years old now. There's many of them are still there. This was a place he would have known well. In fact, that rendering was done by one of his classmates at the American Academy in Rome. And he brings this planting, this Boschetti sort of approach to planting these trees back here. Bryant Park, right? You all well know is the best example of this, right? But you see it in many other places. The Red Hook swimming pool, one of the 11 great swimming complexes that Moses builds in a single summer. Can you imagine us doing that today? Right, 11 pools, and you can see it here. Cadman Plaza in Brooklyn, right? And here you see also the forced perspective. This is one of their finest works. It's still in very good shape. It's also the Brooklyn War Memorial. But again, that sort of boschetto of London plains, right? And you all know that the symbol of the Parks Department to this day is the leaf of the London plane tree. It is not a sugar maple. I've had people say that, no, that's a sugar. No, this is not Canada. This is an early version where it's a little, a little more organic. And this is I think Pentagram did this. Where's our Parks Department? I think Pentagram did their latest version of that. Now Moses, again, channeling Westchester here in the 1934 to 40, had convinced very cleverly, convinced the city to give the Parks Department full authority over parkway construction in the city, right? And even in this period, parkways were still considered, as I said earlier, linear parks. They were considered, an amenity, right? Not a nightmare. And Moses himself called them, and I quote, long ribbon parks with landscaped edges providing passive and active recreation for all age groups resident nearby, right? So they weren't just for the drivers and passengers, right? And this is where we see some of the great parkway projects in New York City. The Henry Hudson, which is one of my favorite roads in the world, even when it's jammed, which was part of the so-called Riverside improvement project, this massive, effort that rebuilt and extended Riverside Park, which originally had been designed by Olmsted, and extended it out with fill on which the Henry Hudson Parkway runs, right? And this is a fleeting moment in the history of the automobile in the American city, because it really represents the finest union of the two. And the 79th Street roundabout, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this is one of Rapuano's watercolor wash renderings. This is part of a 12-foot long rendering of the entire park and parkway. But a lot of what you see here is actually pedestrian infrastructure, right? That beautiful roundabout with the fountain, which has been restored, the promenade, the overlook, the walkways. These are walking and bike trails here in that cloverleaf. So it's this fleeting moment. And one of the things I discovered late in my research on this effort or on this firm was that there was a silenced third partner, a woman named Betty Sprout, a wonderful name for a landscape architect, who had studied at Smith and at the Cambridge School of Landscape Architecture, and eventually marries Gilmore Clarke, and they were married for many years. She was a master plantswoman. She did all the planting plans for most of Riverside Park. She did the planting plans for the Conservatory garden, all of which I have now, and can make available to the parks. In fact, I have been in touch with the folks with the Central Park Conservancy about the Conservatory garden. That's the 12-foot long watercolor rendering of all of Riverside Park, which is reproduced in the book. And as I said earlier, whenever you need to sit down and get a load off, you can thank Gilmore Clarke for the classic, beloved or much hated, depends what your view is, the concrete wood slat park bench, which he designed originally for Playland in 1929. By the end of the 1930s, by the time of World War II, Clarke and Rapuano are already among the most successful landscape architects in the United States. They are also the most politically well-connected, thanks largely to Moses. They create the master plan for the 1939 New York World's Fair, which is largely Rapuano's work. That's his rendering there, as is this. They plan the Harlem River houses. They plan Parkchester in the Bronx, the Taconic, now Williamsburg houses. This is Parkchester. This was one of a number of projects they do with the MetLife Company. They do Stuyvesant Town. They do the site plan for Peter Cooper Village, for Park Fairfax in Alexandria. Here's Stuyvesant Town. In Washington, Clarke serves for 13 or 14 years on the Fine Arts Commission. In fact, he's chair for much of that time of the Fine Arts Commission. He lays out, there's weird conflicts of interest that we're soared over here, but he lays out the Mount Vernon Memorial Highway, which is today's George Washington Memorial Parkway, I think. He plays a major role in the siting of the Jefferson Memorial. And years later, he selects the site for the Pentagon. He also chooses the site for the CIA headquarters and for the Bethesda Naval Hospital. With the National Park Service, he has a long, in fact, the Mount Vernon Parkway was a National Park Service project. He also advises the Park Service on the Mammoth Hot Springs area of Yellowstone. He does the master plan for that. He advises on Skyline Drive in Virginia and sends several of his acolytes from Westchester to design the Blue Ridge Parkway later on. Back here in New York City in the 1950s, do you need me to shut up for a minute?
No,
reloading the film?
Memory.
Of memory, film of a different sort.
Yeah.
Back here in New York City, they create a number of iconic places that we know today. This is actually, believe it or not, does anyone recognize where this is? Yeah, exactly. This is Flushing Meadows Park. This was the master plan for what could have been the United Nations World Headquarters, right? Except the diplomats wanted to play at night and wanted to be near the nightclub, so they built it on the East River. But this was the very last watercolor wash rendering that, as far as I know, that Mike Rapuano did. And even here you can see some of his, right? You can see that long pond, a pool, and axis is sort of tapered in that way. So this isn't built, but they do, Moses makes sure both of them are on the team that plans and designs the East River site for the United Nations. And here too, you see that he's using that tapered forced perspective there. I mentioned earlier that they did the first plan for Idlewild, JFK today. And as America goes mobile, Clarke and Rapuano are there to create some of the most beautiful motor roads in the United States. The Palisades, this is really, I think, one of the finest parkways in the world. The Palisades Motor Parkway or Interstate Parkway. Here you see a drawing of it with the State Line Lookout Park area. One of the bridges here, or a couple of the overpasses, right? They also they planned the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, and then much later on the Garden State Parkway. And Rapuano himself walked every inch of the alignment of the Garden State Parkway, matching it to aerial photography. He didn't quite trust aerial photographs. They were doing stereoscopic, you know, this is after World War II. But he walked the whole alignment and was probably loaded with ticks, although back then they probably didn't have Lyme disease. But, you know, and these are beautiful roads, but they also, as we get past the, you know, deeper into the post-war era, you know, this whole culture and mentality of speed and efficiency really takes over. So the slow pastoral sachet through the landscape of the parkways is kind of shunted aside. And what you get instead is just get me to, you know, to point B as fast as possible. And this converges with this era in New York City history when all the easy builds are done, right? Lacing the Belt Parkway along the water, the Henry Hudson, even the Grand Central. These were routed through cemeteries and waterfronts on fill often. But Moses, he's starting to become a maniac and wants to link up this system through some of the most densely settled neighborhoods in the United States, right? And this is when we get into these very destructive projects like the BQE. Now, partially forgiven for this masterpiece of engineering, which I fear is going to be torn down at some point and replaced with God knows what. But this is the cantilevered structure that carries the BQE underneath Brooklyn Heights, Columbia Heights, and it's crowned by the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, which was largely Clarke and Rapuano's creation. But this is where, that's where they played nice, partly because the then as now, the residents of Brooklyn Heights were not a bunch of poor immigrants. Elsewhere, like my mother's neighborhood, but the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they trenched it right through like this and destroyed a lot of the fabric, cut neighborhoods apart, as you all know. Not unlike the Cross Bronx Expressway. The Cross Bronx has been written about a lot, partly because Robert Caro focuses on it in The Power Broker. But the BQE displaced many times the number of people that the Cross Bronx did. It was a much more convulsive project. And it's in this period, in the post-war period, that, and some of the other, the Van Wyck is largely, the alignment was done by Clarke and Rapuano. In Philadelphia, they create the Schuylkill Expressway, which was immediately branded or rebranded the Shorekill Deathway. And a lot of people died on that road. It wasn't their fault, really. It was squeezed in very, along the river, and they plan interstate highway systems in Nashville, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. This is also the era that American planners get very involved with urban renewal, right? Which is equally destructive, if not more so, than these highway projects, these urban expressway projects. And Clarke and Rapuano take a lead role in this. They actually do the master plan for the very first Title I urban renewal project in the country in Nashville. They plan the Manhattan Civic Center project here. They do the Brooklyn Civic Center urban renewal project, which goes on for years and years. Right, it gave us Cadman Plaza and the War Memorial, which is like one of the city's greatest open spaces, but it also did a lot of destruction in this area of Brooklyn, and parts of it are only now being built out. I'm pretty sure the Brooklyn Academy of Music's parking lot that is now, all I know is there's an Apple store there and Whole Foods, but that was part of the, as far as I know, part of the original vision of the Brooklyn Civic Center project. And then elsewhere, right? In Nashville, here you see the Central Loop project, and this is what came out of it. This notion that density and this kind of urbanism had to be swept away. We needed to irrigate our cities with motor roads and holiday inns. That's the same vantage point. You could see the Capitol building on the hill there. I'm often asked why, if Clarke and Rapuano were such colossal figures, I've referred to them, and throw fruit if you have it, as the Olmsteds of the 20th century. And I think that's a pretty defensible claim, but I've met Olmsted partisans who wish they had fruit on them. So if they were such titanic figures, how come no one's heard of them? I've spoken to many people in the landscape architecture field in New York City and who've never heard of Clarke and Rapuano. And there are a number of reasons for this. I go into huge depth on this in the book. I'll just touch briefly on it here, but there's a number of reasons for this, I think. One is that these men worked on projects of immense scale and complexity, right? These were not little gardens and kidney-shaped pools for California sybaritics. These were huge projects that employed, dozens of consultants often, right? And professionals. So the hand of the designer, the creative hand was hard to find often. And given that, it was a lot easier for a harried journalist or a busy scholar to just, look to the very top of this giant pyramid of expertise and focus there. And who was sitting on the pyramid up top there in New York City, right? It was Moses usually, right? In New York at least, right? And so it's a Moses project. Henry Hudson Park, Moses, Battery of Moses, the mosaic figure, hailing the promised land. And I can understand that. It was a lot easier to describe a project in that way than to parse through all this talent and expertise and figure out who really was the design genius behind these projects. Right. The second reason is that Clarke and Rapuano were part of a transitional generation that has effectively fallen through the cracks in the historiography of American urbanism and landscape. They were, scholarship on American landscape architecture in the 20th century has tended to focus almost obsessively, in my opinion, on the so-called country place era, right, of the Gilded Age, right? Or alternatively, the rise of landscape modernism in the 30s, but mainly in the post-war era. Clarke and Rapuano were neither of these, right? They had no interest in large private estate work. And in fact, they returned the profession to its founding roots, which in the Olmsted era, which was creating these magnificent public landscapes, right? And that's really what they did. But they were not modernists. Clarke would be strident on this point, to the point of I'll tell you a very funny story about that in a minute. But Rapuano was younger. He was about 13, 14 years younger and was more amenable to modernism. But they were totally ignored, or they have been totally ignored by the landscape historians who have written about modernism and modernity in the American landscape. And I think it's ironic because in a way, they were doing these Beaux-Arts style watercolor wash renderings, but they were designing landscapes for the motor car. I mean, what could be more embraceful of modernity than that? I mean, they weren't designing, private estates with, kind of cubist forms for rich people, right? That was no different than the Gilded Age country place era in a way. So anyway, and so that's another reason why. And then finally, the urban expressway and renewal projects that Clarke and Rapuano took on in the post-war era. This was not popular stuff, right? After the 1960s revolution against this kind of top-down planning, led mainly by Jane Jacobs and her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities. It brought that juggernaut to a halt. And, and both of these men were part and parcel of that, right? So in the Planning Academy, there's been very little interest in studying this subject. Let me just tell you that story about Louise now. So Clarke, in his elder years, became a bit of a curmudgeon. He was a member of the Metropolitan Club and pulled all his strings in the Parks Department and the city government to complain that there was this monstrosity across the street that he had to stare at in the edge of Central Park from his favorite window seat at the Metropolitan for lunch and all. And it was this sculpture by Louise Nevelson. He hated the thing. And lo and behold, his complaints found to purchase, disappeared. He goes to church on Park Avenue at the Brick Presbyterian, where he was a member for decades. And there it is, right on Park Avenue, where it still is today at the Park Avenue Mall. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you. I'd love to take questions.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the SKYSCRAPER Museum. So welcome here tonight to celebrate Tom Campanella and this really gorgeous book. Tom is a professor at Cornell and a longtime colleague, an academic who has toiled in the fields and taught at Cornell in how many years, Tom?
12 now.
12, yeah. Only 12 at Cornell, but certainly goes back to graduate school days at
My mentor and first advisor is sitting right here.
very happy who is here. And that connects to the story of this book, which Tom is going to tell, because it was from his early work in a master's thesis, and then as I think he just mentioned, a 35-year project of research. But in between that and the fulfillment in this very beautiful book, there have been other works of a very diverse subject matter. And Tom has published books that are on great big topics, like just before this one, Brooklyn. Some of you may have read that very hefty tome on trees, and the title of the
rise and fall of the American elm on Elm Street.
That's right.
And from the trip that we did in 1992 at Urban Design Studio at MIT,
Concrete Dragon,
the urban revolution in China,
and that is the biggest topic of all. But he also goes high and looks at American cities from the air. In aerial photography. So in this kind of ambitious grasp of trying to tell the stories of cities and landscape, Tom really stands high above others in the profession of tackling really big projects. And this you can see from the book, which is just gorgeous in its execution. And incredibly impressive in the archival research that he brings together. It would seem that the topic of a single firm of landscape architects would be a very focused study. But indeed, the important part of the title of the book, Designing the American Century, is demonstrated in his argument about how this firm touched, and I think, on every aspect, every movement of city planning, urban planning, landscape architecture, parkway infrastructure, in the most extraordinary and little understood way. And so I'll quickly get out of the way in order for Tom to be able to give us some of this portrait and panorama of these really extraordinary designers who deserve to be much better known and now will be. So,
well, thank you. I'd love to take questions. Yes.
Given in the 30s, given how many architects were either totally unemployed or way underemployed, and I suspect the same was true for landscape architects, and yet you look at the project list for Clarke and Rapuano, was there resentment against them in the profession for kind of monopolizing everything?
I've never seen that. I mean, they both were leading, they were leaders of the profession. I mean, Clarke was head of the New York chapter of the ASLA. Rapuano, he was part of the Municipal Art Commission, I think, back then. Rapuano was involved with all different boards and was president of the American Academy in Rome. So I didn't get that sense of a lot of the up and coming students clamored to work for them. And many of these, like that landscape design division, almost the entire staff there, and it was almost 50-50 men and women, were drawn from either Cornell or the American Academy of Art.
Two questions. One's a quickie. What happened to the firm after they passed it on to?
Yeah, that's,
Still exists?
you know, great firms often die slow and painful deaths. This happened with McKinley and White. It happened with the Olmsted firm. I've seen some of the work that the descendant firm was doing in the 1950s. It was like, oh my God. Yeah, they ended up selling to the partners. They got out of the game in 1972 or so. And there were management issues, disagreements among the various figures in the firm. And you know, they started with their star is peaked and it's going down. I mean, one of the last projects they start taking on more engineering projects. The design sort of kernel disappears. I remember one of their last projects was planning a sewer replacement line along Flatlands Avenue. And I'm like, oh my God, how the mighty have fallen. Well, not that I'm against sewage.
It was still called Clarke and Rapuano. Was it still the same name? Firm?
For a while, and then they got gobbled up by a giant engineering conglomerate. The last living partner refused to tell me more about that. Apparently it was a big fight and it got ugly and then they vanished. You know, it happens. I mean, you know, when I was studying landscape architecture, I did an internship one summer with ECPO Dean Austin Williams, EDAW, which some of you may remember. And that's, you know, they were gobbled up by an AECOM and, you know, never to be heard from again. Yeah.
So, two things. One is we are all over the drawings, and two, most of the scenic landmarks in New York are Olmsted, except for Riverside Park.
Yeah.
If you were going to nominate one New York City site, one or two New York City sites that should be scenic landmarks,
Yeah.
Cabin Plaza would be something.
It was definitely Cadman Plaza, the War Memorial. Definitely, if it's not already, Riverside Park, which is partly Olmsted, but most of what you see at Riverside Park today is Clarke Rapuano and the architect, Clinton Lloyd, who was responsible for those magnificent Romanesque forms that you see. Yeah, I think that and the road, Riverside Park and the Henry Hudson, I think is the finest work they ever did.
Riverside Park, yes, but not the road.
Well, their roads should be too. I know the roads are you know, but it's coming into New York City on the Henry Hudson at night is still to me one of the most spectacular entries into the city. You know, anywhere.
Where are those ones?
They're all over the place. A lot are at Cornell. There are the Parks Department has a lot at I think it's at the Olmsted Center. There's some at the New York Historical Society. They're all over the place. Some of them are literally in an attic in Pennsylvania. A lot of Michael Rapuano's work. So harvesting this stuff is, you know, it's taking years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all this. What inspired you to start studying?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in New York City, around the corner from one of the biggest parks that Michael Rapuano designed, Green Park. You know, summers we would drive out to Long Island on the Southern State and the Parkway, both of which they were involved with. And I was turned on to this subject when I was a landscape architecture student at Cornell by one of my professors. And I was fascinated by, you know, I had read the Power Broker or tried to read most of it. And make sure it's behind me on Zoom. It's a whole thing, like I got out the Power Broker behind me. Yeah, I just and I was astonished also that no one knew about it. It's like, my God. These men shape the world we're in, you know, not alone, certainly, but you know, in ways that I felt we needed to understand better. Yeah, all the way back to
What's your next project?
I would like to actually write a smallish book, not 70 book, about the London plane. it's a fascinating, so the list of cities that, where this is the predominant street tree is about maybe 150 cities on almost every continent. And how that happens, you know, is a wonderful story. The Romans and it's a story of empire, it's a story of colonialism, it's a story of happenstance. So I might do that, yeah. Yeah.
Sense of what?
Yes, yes and no. Yeah, so the question is that, you know, as they got involved in these very destructive projects in the post-war period, was there any sense on either part of Clarke and Rapuano that they were aware of and troubled perhaps by this? Rapuano seemed offended by the implication that these roads were nothing but bad. And the toxicity of the urban expressway era sort of back ballooted the Parkways, which he was very proud of, and you know, rightfully so. Clarke was troubled by the whole. Clarke, as I said, became a curmudgeon, and he included in that this need for speed that gripped this country in the post-war period. He complained endlessly about in Garden State Parkway, where the officials there with the state kept pushing them to increase the design speed. He was sickened by the mechanization of post-war America, and became even very vocal, despite being a Republican all his life. He became very vocal about our involvement in the Vietnam War, nuclear weapons. So he really, but he was older and was kind of pulling out of the practice earlier and reflecting. He was also a very religious man. He was an elder at the Presbyterian Church, the Greek Presbyterian Church, and was very troubled by where the world was headed. Wait, let me get somebody else. Was there another question?
Last question.
Yeah.
Last question, kind of technical one. Doesn't the graph, it's of course, to be honest, Mr. Time, who was elevated at the time. It's about what's in the man-made America.
Right.
You said that the earliest parkways, which these guys laid out, surveying techniques have not gotten beyond, have not yet laying things out in straight segments and circle segments, which is why it's uncomfortable.
Well, that's
At some point, they learn how to do spiral segments.
right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The question is about the actual alignment and design, the layout of these parkways. So one of the extraordinary things that Clarke and Rapuano did with these early roads was lay them out in the landscape in a way that that really tread very lightly on the land. And this was before computers could churn this stuff out very quickly, looking at topographic information. They studied the ground, the terrain, and wove these parkways into the landscape in a way that you would think, wow, they've always been here. And they also aligned them as a series of smooth spiral curves. Right now, spiral curves were not new because railroad engineers had been using it for many, many years. You know, a locomotive can't take, violent turns. And so if you look at aerial views of, now some of these roads have been realigned to accommodate the speeding escalates, but they were, if you look at some of the aerial photos, you'll still see them configured as a series of S curves and spiral, where you have this gentle kind of rocking motion through the landscape. What you wanted to avoid was what Clarke called flat wheel or broken back curves, where you had a straight line and then a sudden turn and then straight again and a sudden turn in the same direction. And this is why he hated the Merritt Parkway. The Merritt Parkway was his favorite whipping boy. Partly because it was effectively the northward extension of the Hutchinson, which he designed, and it wasn't actually Merritt. But if you've, I'm sure many of you, most of you have probably driven on it. Merritt is a classic example of how not to lay a parkway gently through the landscape. It lunges down hills, it shoots up hills, you know, and it's beautiful because of all the trees and the lovely bridges, but try driving it as I did many, many years ago during a snowstorm, and you'll see all the cars skated off.
Taconic, it's Clarke.
Oh, the Taconic is one of their masterpieces. The Taconic and the Palisades. Those are, I think, some of the finest roads in the world. Okay, thank you
Okay, so,
all.
yeah.